So this time we want to look at the payroll cycle. Now the payroll cycle is unique in many ways. And so we want to, every time we touch on payroll, just think about some of the ways that it is differentiated and will be dependent upon the type of industry that we are in. Also noting that if you are a bookkeeper or an accountant, you want to remember that payroll is a specialty area in and of itself. So how are you going to put payroll into your bookkeeping system? A few ways you might think about it. Do you want to pick up clients that don't have payroll because possibly they're smaller clients and you're doing like Schedule C tax preparation for bookkeeping for taxes or something like that? Or you might want to come up with a system with payroll that you're working with payroll specialists, possibly outside of QuickBooks, and they're gonna handle the payroll, so you create a network as your go-to system. Or you might want to pay extra for the payroll within QuickBooks that's going to give you the support so that you can do the payroll with the added support. Now, another option would be that you don't buy the added support and try to do payroll manually, but generally wouldn't recommend doing that in the United States, even if you only have a few employees, because payroll is quite complex, including things like withholdings and also other regulations. And unfortunately, you're most likely to run into legal processes and problems with your employees. So you want to be really careful on how you're processing the payroll. Obviously, be careful on who you're bringing on board as employees, because it does have liability related to it and so on, and track everything as nicely as possible. So a couple things to think about on the payroll side, just as we go into it. Note that if you're a small business and you're growing, how can you grow? What are your options for growing? You want to bring in more people. Well, if you want to bring in more people, you could hire people, or you can take on contractors maybe, or you can take on partners, right? Those are kind of your options, some options for expanding, all of those having pros and cons. So you want to keep those in mind. What's the difference if you bring in a contractor versus an employee? Note that in the United States, there's going to be legal differences between a contractor and an employee. And remember that the government is always trying to get you to be an employee normally. So if you're the owner of the business, remember that the IRS is going to try to label your people that work for you as employees. Why? Because they want to make you into their tax collector. That's the point. So if they are the employee, you are responsible then to withhold the money from the employees, which is good for the IRS, right? So they want to incentivize that structure typically. So that means that if you want to hire someone as a contractor, you got to make sure that they qualify as a contractor, so that if the IRS comes after you wanting to say, hey, they're an employee and therefore you're responsible for collecting the tax revenue and giving it to us, then you have to make sure that that's the case. And normally the rules and regulations with that would be, do they provide their own tools? How much control do you have? If they're there on a 9-to-5 job, it's possibly their employees. But if they have more leeway to basically have their own means, their own hours, their own tools on how they're going to create the end product, then it's more likely that they would qualify as a contractor. So there are pros and cons to whether someone's a contractor or an employee, but by far, if they are a contractor, it's a lot easier because you just pay them as basically under the vendor cycle. So you want to be careful with that categorization, but that's the first thing to note. What's the difference between an employee, a contractor, or a partner? If you're a sole proprietorship, you might say, hey, look, I'll pay you part of the equity, the revenue of the company. In that case, you're taking on a partner. And if that happens, then of course you don't have to pay them payroll, and you don't have to deal with even paying them as a contractor, but they might get a share of the revenue in some way, shape, or form. And you have to be very careful about that, because even if you're their family member or something like that, a partner, usually people don't have the same objectives. So if you don't write down a good partnership agreement, then if you have problems with your partner, it's going to be difficult to break up a partnership agreement in that situation because you're giving up some of the equity, some of the control in the business. So those are kind of the pros and cons a little bit of the partnership. Now, if you have payroll, then what are your options for doing payroll? Well, you could do it by hand manually, but we don't recommend doing that in the United States because it's quite complex. Or you can outsource payroll, possibly to some external person that's doing it outside of QuickBooks. The major two big ones here are like an ADP or a Paychex, for example. Or you can pay more for QuickBooks to assist you to do the payroll internally. Now, there's a whole bunch of factors on payroll as to how complex payroll will be. One of those being how many locations is your business in? Because in the United States, for example, there are federal payroll laws and then there's state payroll laws. So if you have to deal with multiple states, then that's going to make it more complex. If you're in one fixed location with one employee, then that might make it a little bit easier to deal with the payroll.